My name is Zareen Perucha. I am a Senior Research Fellow at Anglia Ruskin University based in the UK, and I'll be presenting a short talk this morning for about 20 minutes or so on some of the results from a thematic analysis of justice and inclusion in shared Green Deal experiments. And we'll then be joined for some reflections and commentary by Bogdan Colariu, who is an EU policy officer at Bankwatch. Thank you everyone for being here, and many, many thanks to Bogdan for being able to make it this morning. I'm really looking forward to your reflections. So before I really get into the stuff on justice and inclusion, I just thought I would give a quick summary of the shared Green Deal experiment. And if you just give me a second, my slides are not moving. There we go. Okay, so Shared Green Deal experiment is a 5-year social sciences and humanities project bringing together 22 partners. We still have about a year and a half to go. And the core focus was running these 24 local experiments, 4 each within 6 Green Deal topic areas, so covering everything from clean energy and mobility to preserving biodiversity, circular economy experiments, efficient renovations, and sustainable food. So the thing to note is that Shared Green Deal is about much more than energy transitions. It's about sustainability transitions to really achieve a comprehensive European Green Deal across all of these different sectors and topic areas. And each of these experiments tried to bridge the space between individuals and these wider societal structures. And that's really relevant for what I'm going to say about justice and inclusion. And if people are interested in that framing, I just invite you to look at the paper on the MESO multiple, which was published by Chris Foltz et al. Earlier this year. So what I'll be talking about today is a secondary analysis of how these 24 experiments in these 6 different topic areas dealt with issues of inclusion and justice. There were several of these cross-cutting analyses, each of them associated with a specific Shared Green Deal report and coffee talk. So last week's report dealt with gender, next week's deals with governance, and today's deals with justice, and there are several more. So this is the report which was launched yesterday, and everyone who's on the webinar should have it. It's available at the link on the slide, and it deals with justice, vulnerability, and inequality in the social innovation processes, which were initiated by the Shared Green Deal project. So let's get into it. Basically, what I'm going to present today is relying on just a broad kind of conceptual architecture on the role of inclusion in achieving procedural justice. And let me just click through. Okay, so essentially, I think it's important to just acknowledge the following starting points, which guided the empirical analysis. The first is that the Green Deal has an implicit focus on justice and equity, seeking to effect a transition that leaves no one behind. But it's not possible from the data generated by the Shared Green Deal to talk about specific distributional outcomes of these 24 experiments. But it is possible to say something about procedural justice, which is all about how the experiments managed to give people a sense of equitable and meaningful participation, particularly those most affected by change or from the most vulnerable groups. And that's what the focus of today's talk will be. And by meaningful here, I mean that people should have influence over the outcomes. It's not about representation, which was a point made by Agelli et al. In their report on gender and in the coffee talk last week. So it's not about just including people from vulnerable or marginalized groups, but a sense of deep engagement is essential, and a sense that people have real influence over the outcomes of initiatives. So when I say that we analyzed the secondary data generated by each experiment, this is broadly what I mean. This is the range of data that was generated from each experiment. And I'm not going to go through all of the text on this slide, but essentially, there was an application form which really set out what the local partners would be running the experiments expected in terms of who would be involved and how they would be involved and what they would do and why. During the running of the experiments, there were monthly surveys and meeting notes, which give us a really nice narrative of how the experiments were progressing, including challenges that were met and navigated around inclusion. And then after the experiments, there was a reflective survey and experiment journey text that was produced by the people who ran the experiment, the local partners, which summarized the whole experience and is a really, really good, useful, rich source of data on how inclusion proceeded, what the group dynamics and challenges were. So all of those data sources are really in the local partner's voice. So that's another really strong empirical contribution, which is that it gives a sense of how the organizers are thinking about and dealing with challenges of inclusion. And then there was a set of interviews which were undertaken with the people who participated in the experiment, some of whom were members of the general public from vulnerable or marginalized groups. So all of this was analyzed thematically by myself in vivo, dealing with the questions of who was involved, how were they involved, and what were the outcomes of their inclusion, and what were the qualities of that inclusion. Just a quick bit of context before I get into those findings, just to say that the who and the what of inclusion were broadly preset by the project. So each of the projects in the 6 different streams was given a sort of brief about what activities they'd be running. Some of them were about knowledge generation or knowledge sharing, like adult education programs. Some of them were about coming up with a community vision of the future or setting up labs to deal with particular problems. And then each of those projects was given specific inclusion requirements. So there was a decision taken before the project kicked off about what kinds of groups were considered really relevant to include. And then most of the projects actually went beyond that brief in order to include people from vulnerable or marginalized groups who, in the judgment of the local partners, were relevant to include. So that's important to say. Okay, so let me jump straight into the findings now. Essentially, as I have said, it's not possible to really say anything about the concrete outcomes from inclusion, but it is possible to say in terms of distributional outcomes, but it is possible to say something about what the people who participated actually got out of their participation. So what were the social benefits for marginalized groups who participated in these experiments? And of course, this is not uniform across all of the 24 experiments, but I'm just picking out here in today's talk some of the strongest signals that we got from that broad body of data. The first is that in a lot of the experiments, it was very clear that this convivial social interaction, this formation of strong social groups, that a lot of the experiments paid a lot of attention to achieving, really contributed to positive feelings about the groups and a sense of meaningful engagement. And that this in turn was a strong stimulus for the development of social capital, which means relationships of mutual trust and reciprocity and capacity building that goes beyond the lifetime of the project. So I would argue that this is a very important justice-related outcome, particularly for vulnerable or marginalized groups who have not habitually engaged in civic processes. For many people, this was the first time they were engaging, the first time that they had really had a sense that their engagement was having a meaningful outcome. And I would argue that this may be an important way to initiate further engagement. This is a really, really nice quote. I'm sorry you can't read all of it because of the way that the slide is being shared, but nice quote from the clean energy experiment in Poland, where one of the participants said 15 women gave up half their Saturday, whereas usually women are bound by a lot of domestic tasks, and that was a huge success. The women were very active, and almost immediately as they were introduced, there was this formation of strong social bonds, and you could really feel the chemistry, openness, and energy between everyone. Now, the second set of outcomes really flows from that, which is all around how this strong group formation really helped with capacity building and knowledge sharing. It enabled the sharing of deep knowledge and experience of people's lives and local contexts. And that also mirrors something that was said in the last coffee talk on gender, which is the importance of really listening and sharing people's lived experience. This was enabled in some of the groups where these social interactions were strongest and where people felt that they were really meaningfully engaged. This is a quote that really illustrates that. One of the experiment participants from the Sustainable Mobility Strand in Bulgaria recounted how one of the other participants, who was an older young person, let's say, had forgotten how difficult it was for a younger child to live surrounded by cars, how difficult it is to get around and cross the road, and the danger of not being seen by drivers. And the fact that this younger person had been able to share that experience was really, really impactful and really, really shaped the recommendations that were made by this other participant in their own participation. So this mutual sharing of lived experience has, in a lot of cases within these experiments, really helped to tailor outcomes, and that's an important justice-related outcome. Okay, so I'm now going to go to a set of 3 or 4 challenges that the experiment organizers needed to navigate, and in many cases did successfully navigate, in order to ensure this sense of meaningful inclusion and engagement. The first is there was a great deal of dedicated time, energy, and funding that went into being able to overcome barriers related to the arrangements of daily life, things like lack of affordable public transport, different levels of physical ability. And all of these things were barriers to people being able to be in the room. As well as, and this is such a nice quote that I'm going to try and move this, right? So as well as barriers related just to the way that people's lives are organized in contemporary society. As one of these experiment participants said here, I get the feeling that it's difficult to get citizens moving. We are not used to participating in collective or community activities anymore. And I think this is generalizable really across to a lot of people's lives all across Europe, and indeed increasingly around the world. It's true that there's little awareness of the need for people to participate. And I think this is a really important point that goes to the heart of a lot of engagement challenges, even beyond the difficulties that people from vulnerable or marginalized groups may have. The next one is related to that, and it's all around navigating the social and cultural terrain which can challenge knowledge co-production. So in contexts where there is a prevailing cultural framing of expertise and a tendency to prioritize technical expertise, this can really influence the willingness of citizens, particularly from vulnerable groups, to come forward and engage. And in many of the experiments, some of the narratives of the organizers were all about the careful and continuous facilitation that was required in order to overcome this barrier. There's a nice quote from the Greek social experiment on preserving biodiversity, where this local partner who organized it said, in Greece, there seems to be this culture that dictates accepting knowledge only from experts of a special field instead of exchanging knowledge and experience with people. I think people tend to be more open to an expert talking about a field than understanding how they can learn from other people's experiences. So hopefully I don't need to labor the point that this is an important justice-related outcome, to be able to facilitate for people to go beyond this. And it's really, really important, particularly when trying to understand the experiences of vulnerable and marginalized groups. And then there's a really interesting challenge which came out of some of the data, where in communities where there has been a long-standing disengagement, long-standing histories and legacies of marginalization, this can affect the trust that everybody has in the process and really has a strong impact on people's willingness to engage. And very interestingly, there were some testimonies that people in relative positions of power are equally hesitant to engage in such contexts. So for example, in the case of the Clean Energy Project in the UK, which was undertaken in an area where there's been a long-standing history of social deprivation, the local partner who organized the project pointed out that this is a community where people are very underserved. And this legacy, this history of disadvantage has undermined a lot of trust between the community and the local council. As a result, participants from the council feel, in her words, very nervous about coming into a conversation with the community. So this again really highlighted to me the importance of all of these factors that I'm going to talk about now, in enabling inclusion in these complicated contexts and in these complicated terrains. These are the kinds of things that really helped in these contexts. The first is an attention to deep local knowledge. And one of the strongest lessons from some of the experiments was that small organizations with deep local experience are really invaluable partners. And the lesson from that is that funding structures need to support this, and partners need to be able to have enough of a say in the design of the experiments to challenge any preset briefs about what needs to be done. The second lesson is that direct engagement by people, particularly citizens from challenging so-called contexts, is irreplaceable. Whatever context-specific barriers to people being in the room are present need to be overcome. Two big ways of overcoming that is sensitive facilitation, particularly using creative and playful methods. And the second is being able to build social capital and well-functioning, tightly knit groups is an important prelude to engagement. And we would argue that this is a justice-enabling outcome in itself because it helps to overcome disconnection and isolation. And food helps. A lot of the experiments had opening events which were centered simply around getting people around a table and sharing food. Very important when designing these things to think about this right from the beginning. And I'm going to close with a couple of policy recommendations, which I should say are possibly not novel at all, but it's just very helpful that the data has sent these quite strong signals around policy structures being able to explicitly support direct and meaningful engagement and procedural justice will probably be really, really important. There needs to be careful attention paid to funding regimes which should support the engagement of small local actors and be able to support the long-term nature of social innovation, particularly when we're overcoming challenges of long-standing legacies of exclusion. And it might be really, really helpful to establish an EU platform to share knowledge, best practice, and build capacity for inclusion for procedural justice, particularly in recognition of the fact that there will be different cultural and social terrains across different vulnerable regions in the EU, where there will be specific shapes and qualities to all of this that needs to be taken into account. Right, and I think we're doing pretty well for time. Thank you, everyone, for that, for listening. I'm now going to hand over to Bogdan. Bogdan, you've got about 10 minutes. Thank you so much again for being here, and I'm really looking forward to your comments.
Thank you also for this great presentation. I hope you can hear me well.
Yep.
Great. So I will go fast forward and say that, okay, I would like to zoom out a bit and zoom in again with some reflections and some food for thought. So first of all, to zoom out, I was really wondering if actually when I was reading the results, I was questioning Are we actually in a good time for justice and inclusion, or in a bad time? Are we going to look back to this as a fantastic decade, or actually a time of disaster? And I would like to say that we do have a lot of islands of hope. We have learned a lot how to fight our biases, how to give a voice to the voiceless, how to understand marginalized communities, even how to provide a voice for nature or for animals, and how to bring together old, young people, how to bring more intergenerational justice. Is this new? So and so. Like, some experiments have been here with us maybe since the 60s. However, some of them made it to the mainstream today, which is actually quite important. And some of them are even featured in the EU agenda. And especially in the 5-10 years, we've seen a lot of direct democracy experiments, more randomized selection, municipalism, a lot of formats to go down to the local level. However, we also have some challenges, like the unusual suspect that we're always looking for is also becoming a moving target, and it's very fluid. And for instance, the privileges of the past are sometimes evolving, and it's getting more and more complex to find the unusual suspects in certain formats. Also, something positive, we are more and more aware of the limits of our models, and that's also a positive news. On the other side, there's also a time of disaster. There's a recentralization of political decision. There's, at some levels, the tokenization of inclusion or false diversity. And the trend towards top-down models and centralization is also around the corner. Also, maybe something positive, a good story and a bad story, that's up to you to judge it. The market-driven economy in the context of globalization came also with some good and bad things. For instance, we had some interesting models of diversity and inclusion, yes, for the sake of markets or capital. Came also with the bad thing, like we objectified a lot diversity and inclusion and justice, and everybody was okay with their own identity, and everything was fine as long as you don't disturb the market-driven logic. So that was also something bad and good happening in the past years, with some positive and negative spillovers. Now zooming back in on the Green Deal and on justice and participation in this context, I would like to say that I think it's very challenging to work in the context of the Green Deal, and especially in this context, I appreciate your work. The Green Deal is literally an ecosystem of sticks and carrots that direct us towards a destination. It's even hard to grasp for experts. It includes a lot of funding instruments, policies, legislation, and national transposition. And often there's the place where there's a lot of tension on inclusion, justice, and marginalization. When the EU level meets the local level, especially in the transposition, also the culture and other factors really influence this a lot. So I think it's very complex to find this meso level, but it's very interesting overall to do it. To give you an example, it's maybe very technical. In the Green Deal context, there are some strategies that are called national energy and climate plans. You'll have member states that really dedicate a chapter to participation and to engagement, and countries that don't dedicate a paragraph to it. So there's incredible difference on how these things are actually transposed. Now, something very interesting, and I wanted to comment on it based on the slides. very interesting is this narrative on specific inclusion requirements. And I think this is a topic that brought a lot of debates. And one of the debates is in the context of monitoring committees. Bankwatch worked actually a lot in the past years on something that is called partnership principle. It's maybe a very old principle coming along the cohesion policy funds, which actually it's now a legal requirement for some years, saying that affected people have to be part of programming the funds and implementing the programs. Now, how you do this at the local level and so on, it's kind of complex. And we've seen like the development in the past 20, 30 years on this. It actually requires that each fund has a sort of a local parliament that designs a program. We've seen a lot of different approaches here. Like there's a big difference if actually you offer a grant for citizens to go in these meetings, or if citizens go there without any financial support. Participation has, of course, limits, technical limits, knowledge limits, financial limits, privilege limits, and so on. So that's something quite interesting. And this partnership principle actually evolved a lot, both vertically and horizontally. Now I would like also to say a few things about inclusion. I think overall we don't talk a lot about the benefits of inclusion, especially in these particular times that we can describe as a polycrisis or a meta-crisis. We really have to discuss a lot about resilience. In a very simplified way, at the individual or community level, resilience is something dependent on many individuals. It's pretty important, if not crucial, for all of us to know personally electrician, a chemist, a farmer, a simple person surviving adverse economic or social conditions. And in times of collapse, we really need their learnings in our immediate proximity. Why I'm saying this? Because too often we frame inclusion as something beneficial for rather abstract things like for policy objectives, for funds, or just for those left behind. But that's not truly accurate. I dare to say that is the only tool that can provide access to asymmetrical points of view, skills, learning, especially in times of crisis. And I very much appreciated the fact that you are talking a lot about sharing deep knowledge in these groups and not just project or program or policy or investment points. Also, sometimes we have to focus on doing this, including marginalized people and pushing for justice, because it builds up society. That's a purpose in itself. Perhaps we really need to reevaluate the importance of participation and inclusion in policies and investment, as in the Green Deal, because they serve a much bigger purpose than this. Now, I also want to say at the end that we have also a lot of challenges to navigate. So there are many barriers, as you said, from transport to daily life or to levels of ability. I would add additional barriers like knowledge gaps, dealing with the oppressed, not only with the marginalized, and too much emphasis on verbalization. We go to a lot of meetings where actually verbalized skills are the most important. We definitely have to make a step beyond this. We also have to deal with people uncomfortable with talking and to find better alternatives. Now, the last comments about the policy recommendation. Yeah, it's essential to think more often about what is meaningful and what has impact. When we plan participation events, of course, we have to think about those uncomfortable to speak in public, or people that have very few friends or no friends, that not often express opinions, that cannot understand abstract things like vision or agenda. Like, we have to deal with things that are really beyond our understanding. And also how to include more the segments of the voiceless. Some food for thought for the future. Is climate a local topic or a regional one? Is it a bioregional topic? How do we get to the collective intelligence of these people? For instance, especially in the climate topics, we talk a lot about a river doesn't care if it crosses a border or goes through 2 cities or 3 cities or 3 communities or 5 communities. I think we have to reimagine a lot of formats on this. And also how to explore more existing formats like school meetings, apartment building meetings, existing clubs, and so on. That's it. I think I'm running out of time. Thanks again for this.
Thank you so much, Bogdan.